Shame on you for doing
We
that.
don't.
Shame on you for glorifying terrorism.
Unacceptable affront
Shame
to
on
the
you.
rules-based
To create
global order,
pretext for
and will
conflict.
have enormous economic...
And it is alarming.
We have access to endless information, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction, especially during a crisis. But one prominent human rights organization is finding ways to cut through the noise and properly identify threats.
It's really interesting to work in this space and to really have to think about where this information is coming from, how people are capturing it and sharing it.
Mitch Paquette is with Amnesty International. His team uses open source intelligence to investigate human rights abuses.
Put yourself in the position of someone who is filming that event. They're not going to be using necessarily like third-person objective speaking that you would hear from a news organization.
He says social media and a systematic workflow are essential for harnessing the vast amount of information online.
We all kind of have an understanding of what we bring to the team, what kinds of things we're going to be contributing to the work, and we know each other's skill sets.
We'll dive into what it's like coordinating a team across 6 different countries as crises unfold, and how you can take advantage of OSINT using tools available at your fingertips. Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Welcome to another edition of SitRep. We're now joined by Mitch Paquette. And Mitch, thank you for being here with us. Why don't you introduce yourself and explain a little bit more about the work that you do?
Hey, Tristan, thanks so much for having me. Yes, my name is Mitch Paquette. I am a researcher with Amnesty International's Crisis Evidence Lab, which is part of our crisis response program. And specifically, I focus on open source research, so using information from online sources and other publicly available information to document human rights violations across the globe, and further Amnesty's mission of providing an accurate accounting of those human rights violations.
Now, from what you were telling me, the Crisis Evidence Lab relies heavily on social media and online posts to verify human rights abuses. And of course, there's a whole swath of other team members and organizations, if you will, or groups within Amnesty that help out with that. I think a lot of people might be listening to this and thinking to themselves, why does Amnesty International need a huge or sizable, at least, online and social media team? And I think that would be worth explaining, Mitch.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think when a lot of people think about Amnesty International and our research historically, it has always been the idea that you have in your mind, I think, is often of a person who goes into the field, into a different country where there's some sort of event taking place, and they speak to witnesses or victims, gathering testimony and other physical evidence, which we use to build a case. That's still a huge part of the work that we do and still a very fundamental pillar of Amnesty's work. However, what we're finding is that in the modern era, and thanks to digital technologies, which flood every aspect of our life these days, we have access to other sources of information that we haven't utilized or leveraged for this purpose in the past. And we can really use those effectively in partnership with these other methodologies for research and fact-finding to create ultimately a better, more accurate documentation of human rights violations. And so one of the ways that we're able to do that is through social media content. Probably one of, and that's what I focus on with my work as an open source researcher. So our team is still fairly small. We're around 7 or 8 people. And we're a multidisciplinary team. So while I focus on open source information and research, gathering content from social media and other online platforms, we also have someone on our team who specializes in weapons analysis and weapons identification. We have a satellite imagery and remote sensing expert. We have other people who specialize in data analysis and working with large data sets. And so together we kind of pair all these different skills to utilize different forms of information towards the goal that Amnesty International has always had.
Well, and talk a little bit more about one of the groups known as the Digital Verification Corps, because that sounds like a really interesting initiative And it certainly speaks to the work that you and your team are doing when it comes to identifying human rights abuses.
Absolutely. So the Digital Verification Core is a program that sits within the Crisis Response Program and within the Evidence Lab. And it started around 5 years ago by a former colleague of mine named Sam Dubberly, who really had this idea alongside others within the organization that, we're making more and more use of these new research methodologies. However, there's still a huge gap within the human rights field of people who are able to do this research effectively. People who were previously trained in different kinds of fact-finding and evidence gathering and didn't necessarily have the skill set to do this work at the level or the scale that we need to within an organization like Amnesty International. So the Digital Verification Core was set up to really address that challenge in a big way. So it was designed to create partnerships with universities across the globe. So currently we have 6 partner universities, and every year around 100 different students come through the Digital Verification Core. We provide training in open source research methodologies. We work with them to learn skills like how to discover content on social media platforms, running effective online searches, and then verification techniques. So how to conduct a reverse image search, how to use satellite imagery and other mapping tools to verify the location, a process called geolocation of photos or videos that document potential human rights violations. So we set this program up and we've been training, around 100 students every year. Those students have then found their way into other organizations. So we have people that are working for the New York Times. We have people that are working for the UN, other NGOs, as well as human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I myself am an alumni of the Digital Verification Core. I was a volunteer with that program before I joined Amnesty as a staff member on the Crisis Evidence Lab. So, and then we also, the other side, so we provide training, and then the way that we allow students to then put this into practice and explore these skills and these methodologies is working directly with Amnesty on our different investigations. So if we're looking at a sort of large scale event, like a mass protest that goes on for months and months, such as, protests that we've seen in Myanmar or in Chile in 2019, or in Colombia last year. There's all sorts of examples where we've been able to use this large group of students to help us gather and verify content at scale so that we can better document these mass events.
And I think the elephant in the room recently anyway is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We will certainly dig into that a little bit. But I think before we look at individual case studies, if you will, Mitch, take us into a bit of a deeper dive in terms of how exactly you and your team identify human rights abuses, especially in the era of misinformation and disinformation.
It's a really good question and a really important one. As you note, the challenge, there's obviously so many benefits to using material that is posted online to document human rights abuses. It allows us to gain access to areas that we might not be able to visit in person or to send someone into. We can find events all across different cities and cover massive amounts of territory without having to physically be in all those places at once, which would be impossible. So there's all these benefits, but obviously the big drawback is that you can't trust everything that you see online. We've all had those moments where we've, seen a video or seen an image and it turned out to be from a completely different country or a completely different year and was circulating out of context, or was intentional disinformation by a particular actor to try to create false understandings or to sort of disrupt the information space. So, the way that we kind of navigate that while trying to find solid evidence of human rights violations is first to just look and see what's out there. So we use different methods for conducting precise searches. So we use different advanced search functions, different search operators to sort of filter down how much information we're working with and really look at something that's going to be more specific to the research questions that we're ultimately trying to answer. And then we evaluate the content for its ability to address those research questions. So, if we're talking about a mass protest, maybe one thing that we're trying to document is the use of less lethal ammunition in a manner that would be unlawful, or the use of live ammunition to disrupt protests. So we're looking for very specific violations, and then we're trying to find content that effectively addresses those questions. Once we've done that, and we found content that might provide evidence of possible human rights violations, then we need to verify that the content is actually from the place that it's supposedly from, and from the place that we're trying to document violations in, as well as from the time period that events are supposedly taking place in. So we use techniques like geolocation, which I mentioned earlier, where we use different tools and imagery sources to match up with distinct features in a video. Maybe it's a bridge in a background or a particular shop sign if we're in an urban environment, to be able to say for sure that, yes, this video was captured at this exact location. And then we use different techniques for chronolocation. So we'll run a reverse image search, make sure that piece of content hasn't appeared online in a prior incident or in a previous year or month, whatever it might be. And then looking at other things like the shadows in the video to confirm the time of day, make sure that checks out with other sources of information that we have, whether it's reporting from the ground or other things. So it's never just one piece of content in isolation, but those are the processes that we go through to verify it. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, we're still an organization that prides ourselves on really quality reporting from the ground. So we'll try to pair that information with witness testimony and other sources to be able to corroborate what we're finding in the visual content.
It's interesting to think of social media and an online post as open source intelligence. I realize that it consists of a lot more, but when you keep, OSINT in mind, and especially the word intelligence, you're thinking, maybe undercover reports or leaked documents, right? That's kind of the stereotypical image you get. But I can think of a couple times, and I've never, witnessed any horrific events, thankfully, but I can think of a couple times where I filmed a protest, or there was a traffic disruption, or who knows what. And, granted, where I'm broadcasting from Canada, usually that doesn't result in a whole lot. But it's funny to think how someone's random tweet or random Facebook post eventually ends up as part of OSINT and eventually ends up as part of these open source investigations, because I don't think a lot of people really think of it in that manner.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a field that's developing rapidly across a lot of different sectors, whether it's journalism, whether it's security, or whether it's human rights investigators. I think people are finding different ways to utilize this information, or they're finding that they can utilize it. I think everybody's at kind of different places in how they are looking at social media. I think what we've often found is that people aren't necessarily going out to document a human rights violation. Maybe they're just filming an event outside of their house that they're watching happening, and they think, oh, I'll pull up my camera phone and I'll take a video. And those things often get picked up very quickly by other sources. They get amplified across social media, and that's or we find them through very precise searching and using different keywords. I think one of the interesting aspects of our work and of the investigative process is that one of the skills that we utilize, or one of the tips that we teach our students, is to think about, when you're searching for content, to put yourself in the position of someone who is filming that event. They're not going to be using necessarily like third person objective speaking that you would hear from a news organization or something. They're going to be saying like, they might be using profanity in their tweet. They might be saying like, you'll never believe what I saw outside my house. And, those aren't necessarily things that you think about including when you're trying to search for content. But in our line of work, that's really how you find these videos that are sort of kind of that crucial piece of evidence that we often need, which is the witness footage from the ground and directly from the scene that helps us corroborate what happened in an event. So it's really interesting to work in this space and to really have to think about, where this information is coming from, how people are capturing it and sharing it, and how you can effectively find it and then make use of it through verification and through other forms of analysis.
How would some of these techniques and some of the methods you're describing, how could that potentially apply to the world of security? Now, obviously, I realize that you investigate human rights abuses, but I'm hearing a lot there where if you're a security professional at an important organization, at a major corporation, or even at a small business, it sounds to me like there would be a lot to take away from the methodology and the techniques that you and your team are using when it comes to protests and civil unrests and human rights abuses, because at the end of the day, those events inevitably and ultimately result in a security risk of some sort to someone.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's at the end of the day, the tools are pretty much the same that you would use, whether you're monitoring for the purposes that we often are, or you're monitoring as a security professional. The content that you have to work with is going to be the same. We're all basically pulling from the same data source, which in many cases is social media or other forms of online content. And really, it's just a matter of how you're using that information, what value you find from it, and how you want to make use of it. So, I mean, I think, oftentimes when we're monitoring, if we're monitoring a situation, a protest, we might be looking to figure out where the protest is located. We might use features like the Google Maps feature that tells you where there's traffic disruptions, right? We might use that to figure out, there's probably a protest or a clash happening here between a group of people. And that's how we interpret that is, we should look in this area to find out what's happening here, to find footage of whether there's potentially human rights violations taking place. But equally, that traffic disruption is going to mean a lot to someone who's working in the security field. So I think it's ultimately the same forms of information and the same tools for gathering it and for monitoring these various sources. But at the end of the day, it's really just a matter of what your purpose is. For us, it's what research questions we're trying to answer. For others, it might be, what's going to be the impact on this particular company or this particular business, given these events. So it's really just a matter of interpretation and what you're trying to draw from that information.
This is, I think, a perfect case study to demonstrate sort of what you and your team do. So how are you guys monitoring the developments in Ukraine as that area deals with just horrific circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely, Tristan. So, I mean, I think the whole world is really watching these events unfold at the moment. Whether, you're doing it in my day, this is kind of the main focus of our work right now, is trying to really get a sense of what's happening minute to minute within Ukraine as the Russian forces advance at various points. And it's a complicated information space without question. There's a lot of, they talk about the fog of war. This is definitely not dispelled by the fact that we now have all of this content online. It's still a very chaotic situation. It's still very hard to get a picture of what types of things are happening on the ground. But we can get a pretty good sense. So we're really looking for incidents of civilian casualties, damage to civilian buildings. So whether it's a residential apartment building, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a school. Unfortunately, we've seen cases of all of these reportedly being damaged in the conflict through various means. So what we're doing is really just using various social media platforms. So at the moment, we're working across Telegram. We're finding lots of content on TikTok. Even before the conflict started, when there was a buildup of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, there was constant videos on TikTok of people filming troop movements, whether it's vehicles driving through their city on their way to the border, or whether it's, soldiers setting up a camp somewhere. All of that was being documented, and by some organizations even meticulously mapped as it was taking place, which is, I think, something that we've never seen people in a public setting be able to do before. This is something that maybe a military intelligence could piece together. But in this case, we were seeing people doing this type of work on their own, just from their own computers and using open source information. So I think we've really seen a lot of different opportunities for getting a sense of a conflict through this recent and horrific events in Ukraine. So yeah, I guess from our monitoring, I talked about the types of events that we're looking for, and I spend most of my day using Telegram and Twitter, especially a tool called TweetDeck, which allows you to monitor different streams of content on Twitter to try to figure out in what cities there's fighting, where there's reported events of the type that we're interested in. And then once we find that content, to really dig deep and find those types of videos that you were mentioning earlier of someone who, is maybe just sitting in their home and all of a sudden there's a plane flying overhead, or there's an airstrike that falls outside of their kitchen window. So finding those types of footage to be able to document these things has been a really important way that we've been able to respond to the conflict within Amnesty. Even in the early days, we've already issued a number of reactive tweets documenting indiscriminate attacks on largely on civilian targets within Ukraine. So these are violations of international humanitarian law. And, I've also been using other tools because we're trying to monitor such a massive information space. So I've been relying a lot on tools like Samdesk that allow me to sort of monitor different cities and be alerted to different incidents. Whether it's internet disruptions in the area, which have a big implication for my work about how much content I can expect to be coming out, why there might be a drop in how much documentation I'm seeing online, to, reports of very recent attacks on hospitals or schools, whatever it might be, that I'm then able to do further research on.
And how do you manage a team that it's spread out over the world? I think, Mitch, and not just talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I know that your team's done work on many instances of human rights abuses from all corners of the planet. How do you manage a team that it could be spread out over several continents and different time zones trying to look at all this information?
It's a really good question, Tristan, in terms of how we manage an effort like this with a team that is spread out across various continents and time zones. This is something that we deal with in all of our work because we are a remote team. We have colleagues based in multiple cities across the globe. And then when we work with our digital verification core student volunteers, they are also based at 6 different locations across the globe. So as you can tell, it gets challenging logistically. However, when you're doing monitoring of a active and rapidly progressing conflict, that can also be a massive benefit. So being able to do kind of round the clock monitoring given people's different time zones is really valuable. It allows us to keep tabs on things, even, after I log off at the end of the night, someone else can pick up that work and continue with the documentation so that we're not having large gaps in our understanding of a conflict, which if it's changing minute to minute, 6 hours of sleep can be a big change. It'll be a completely different conflict in the morning. So the way that we manage that type of interaction is largely just through really having very systematic workflows. So we all kind of have an understanding of what we bring to the team, what kinds of things we're going to be contributing to the work. And we know each other's skill sets. So it might be that I'm working all day to find different content related to a particular airstrike or a particular event. I kind of finish my work, maybe I've geolocated a couple of videos that show where an airstrike took place. I can then pass that information over to a colleague in the US who's able to look for satellite imagery before and after that event to corroborate the footage that I've seen and analyzed with satellite imagery that shows maybe a building that's intact yesterday and today there's significant damage to it. So we can kind of put together our different expertise and different ways of information gathering, despite the distance and despite the difference in times, to really work in a collaborative way. But it just comes down to kind of knowing the roles of each member of the team and being able to effectively pair those skill sets as much as we can.
What's the biggest challenge in your mind of managing a team that's so spread out, especially when events develop so rapidly?
The biggest challenge, I think ultimately the biggest challenge is just coordination. It's just being able to communicate and to communicate effectively. This is also the key. The key to making the work successful. And it's much easier said than done, right? Because when you're monitoring a conflict like, the conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, you can imagine that I don't necessarily have time to take a break constantly to let other people know what I'm working on or what I'm doing, because everything is happening so quickly and we're just trying to gather as much information as we can. I've kind of skirted around this, but there's also a challenge working with social media content that things might be removed. Content isn't permanent once it's uploaded to social media. So there is a level of pace that we're working at that is not necessarily conducive to collaboration when you're not in the same space as someone else. So there are a lot of challenges given the pace and of the work and just the fact that situations are constantly changing during a conflict or a crisis. So, it doesn't always work perfectly, but the way that we try to address that is just through having done this time and time again. You already rattled off, I think, 3 different global crises at a global scale over the past 3 months past 2 months since the year began. A lot of us have been doing this work for many years and working together on projects like this. So we kind of get a sense for how this plays out and what we all bring to the table. And I think that's how we get through it. Just through experience and being able to reflect on what went well the last time and what we can improve on the next time.
Have you noticed any glaring vulnerabilities brought to the forefront because of the pandemic? And what I mean by that, Mitch, is any lapses in government authority or any lapses in potentially security to keep people safe, especially since you monitor human rights abuses. And again, the pandemic, I know as one example, we've spoken about not so much a security issue, but in terms of corporate security anyway, but in terms of individual security, one of the things that a lot of people have brought to the forefront is abuse. Right? That has been something that has been a huge concern for a lot of people because more of us are staying at home. So I'm wondering if we use that as an example and then kind of extrapolate that, if you will, to the work you do. Have you seen any major vulnerabilities where it's like, this wasn't as much of an issue before the pandemic, and now it is for our investigations, be it your methodology, your techniques, whatever it may be, as you're tracking these human rights abuses and civil unrest, protests, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the vulnerabilities that has been brought out by the pandemic, specifically as it relates to open source information generally, but specifically on social media platforms, is the threat of disinformation and misinformation. And the kind of inability currently to manage those spaces effectively. Whether it's pandemic related or whether it's directly related to different issues on the ground in different countries, like we're seeing information and misinformation proliferate rapidly across social media, picking up large amounts of traction, creating insular sort of communities around certain beliefs that are often or that can be informed by false information that is circulating widely online. And so I think one of the things that the pandemic has brought out is just how much of a problem that can be for everyone involved when you're trying to manage a global crisis like this, and you have people following these sources of information in mass numbers that are not sharing information that is backed by science or by health research or by any sort of sound information. So I think that is one challenge that we've really seen a lot online during the pandemic. I think other things that we've witnessed is just ability, especially when there are all of these kind of strict measures, when the world is maybe paying attention to other things. We have seen the pandemic give rise to a lot of events that should spark a lot of concern globally. And I think that because people's attention is directed elsewhere, because people are just trying to get through a global health crisis, I think we're seeing different governments taking advantage of that opportunity to commit abuses against their people, or to engage in more violent crackdowns of even small protests or demonstrations in their area. We've seen many internet disruptions and in blackouts in certain countries during the pandemic as well. So I think the pandemic has created this space where people are not able to get onto the ground as easily to document these types of events. People are not, maybe looking for this type of content as much because of just the nature of living during a global pandemic. And it's led to a lot of abuses globally in many different countries.
Anecdotally, Mitch, based off of the work you do, would you say that civil unrest and protests, would you say that those are increasing in number and perhaps intensity? Again, I just think of the first couple months of 2022 and all the unrest and conflict we've already seen. But you've been at this for several years. So would you say that that's an increasing concern?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I've definitely found myself thinking about that quite a lot in recent times, especially. I think I've seen it have two different effects. In one sense, it has, I think, had an increase, or it has led to an increase in civil unrest or demonstrations or public protests, whatever you want to refer to it as. I think part of that is because the pandemic has brought to the forefront in a lot of different places, sort of historical inequalities, different issues faced by particularly marginalized populations, as we've all been really affected by this global health crisis and the impacts that it's had on different governments, on different economies, people's ability to work and engage in that way. And so I think in some places we have seen it have an effect where there has been an increase in public demonstrations as a result of this. I think in another sense, we've also seen it have the opposite effect, where you've had potential protests that maybe haven't happened because countries have been facing severe lockdowns, because people have been afraid for their own health or their family's health to go out and engage in public protests or things like this. So I think it is hard to say, because it's hard to measure how many protests may have happened or may not have happened because of the reality that we're living through right now. But I definitely think that there has been, especially as of late, a pattern of civil unrest taking place more frequently across different countries, and we've seen that over the past 6 months, 2 months of this pandemic.
So what would be your advice to let's say, the security professional out there, or maybe you can point them in a direction where they hear about all these tools, they hear about social media, and they think to themselves, I want to incorporate some of this into my new security strategies or into my new methods of making sure employees and colleagues are safe. So if you had to give a short list or some recommendations in terms of where they can tap into these resources easily and in a way that's comprehensive, where can they start?
I mean, I think the best place and the place where most people, I think, have started, at least in my experience, is Twitter. I mean, there's specific Twitter groups that you can follow. One of the groups that's quite active and has a lot of different people who are affiliated with it is Bellingcat. We have our own blog where we share different tools and tips. It's called Citizen Evidence Lab. It's a blog website. Maybe we can share it, the link to that. But a lot of people are willing and open to share information that they have. Another Twitter community is OSINT Curio. So if you can find these groups, start following different people, the work that they put out. A lot of them participate in this Twitter community as well around quiz time. So hashtag quiz time, and people will put up different geolocation challenges, and anybody on Twitter can engage with these images and videos and try to geolocate these pieces of content to really get experience in this line of work, and then to connect with other people who are also using these tools. So I think the online space is full of different sources of information, different people who are always willing to have a conversation, to chat. And I would just encourage people to kind of find an entry point into it, whether it's a specific person on Twitter, whether it's a specific group or a blog or, some other kind of online resource, and then just keep going with that. Find the people who are a part of it, who are leading that effort, get in touch. And in my experience, everybody in this field has been really willing to help each other out, and share what they've learned, in this, kind of new and quickly developing space.
Okay. Mitch, this has been a fabulous conversation. Really appreciate your insight, and I think there's a lot of information to digest there, and a lot of ways that security professionals and those in related fields too can hopefully bolster the resources they have and enhance maybe the work that they do through some of the methods that you use for your own work. Very useful information, Mitch. I absolutely want to give you a plug, though, because you said that the Crisis Evidence Lab and the Digital Verification Core at Amnesty International has some resources there that could be helpful for gaining access to this information or figuring things out. So, Mitch, feel free to plug that. Where can people find more information about you and the work you do and the work that Amnesty International does?
Yes. So I mentioned this earlier. We have a blog where all members of our team, as well as external collaborators, share, different case studies. We share tools that we develop. We share training resources, and that is called citizenevidence.org. So the blog is called Citizen Evidence Lab, and it's at citizenevidence.org. You can also follow all of Amnesty's work on our website or at Amnesty on Twitter. We have a course online with an organization called Advocacy Assembly. We have a 2-part course that we developed on open source investigations, specifically for human rights, but the tools and techniques that we share there will be useful to anyone. So there's a 2-part course on there. It's mostly videos and different exercises. So if people are getting started, that might be a really good place to go to. So you can find that on Advocacy Assembly and just navigate to the Amnesty tab of that website.
All right, Mitch Paquette with Amnesty International joining us on SitRep. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me, sitrep@samdesk.io, or follow us on Twitter @samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.